Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive from FP&A Done Right.
It's great to be here.
I'm Ethan, and with me today, as always, is Emma.
Hi, everybody.
Today we're looking at Workday Adaptive Planning and what it can do for companies out there, specifically in the software as a service and tech spaces.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that we see often is that a lot of software as a service companies have a lot of the same characteristics when it comes to their financials, right?
Yeah.
They're focused on recurring revenue, and a lot of times they don't have a huge need for capital expenditure. So managing their profit and loss is super important for these companies.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, because a lot of the benefits that we're going to be talking about today really speak to those characteristics and speak to those needs. So why don't we jump into our first example here? Think about a fast-growing software as a service business that's really scaling up, and their existing systems and processes. Maybe they're using spreadsheets for budgeting, planning, forecasting, and reporting. It just isn't cutting it anymore. They're outgrowing it, and they're really looking for a more robust and sophisticated way to approach those core financial planning processes.
Right. And I think that's pretty common. You see that a lot with companies that are going through high growth.
Yeah, because they're a software as a service business, it's really all about managing that profit and loss, right? Like we said, they don't have a lot of capital expenditure, so they're really focused on, that recurring revenue and how that flows through their P&L. So the challenge that they were facing was they needed a model that could really accurately reflect that recurring revenue, and they needed a way to kind of manage their multi-year planning. They wanted to look out 2, 3, 4 years into the future and really understand how that revenue was going to trend and how that was going to impact their profitability.
Right. And so in this case, what they did was they implemented a revenue model within Workday Adaptive Planning. And this wasn't just your, run-of-the-mill revenue model. It was specifically built to incorporate their annual recurring revenue streams.
And that's such a key point, right? It's not about just kind of using a generic out-of-the-box solution. It's about really customizing and tailoring it to the specific needs of that software as a service business.
Exactly.
So what this really allowed them to do is to get really granular with their profit and loss. They could really see, okay, what are all the different contributing factors to our revenue? What's our churn rate? Like, what's our customer acquisition cost?
Yeah.
How are these things trending over time? And how are they all coming together to impact that bottom line?
Right. And, you think about it like a software as a service business, their revenue is very nuanced, right?
Yeah.
It's not just like selling a widget. They have all these different subscription models and different revenue streams. So being able to model that accurately is really key.
And so what were some of the kind of tangible results that this company saw from implementing this revenue model?
Well, for one, they had much better visibility into their future revenue. They could accurately forecast what their revenue was going to be, 1, 2, 3 years out, which is really important for a business like this.
Yeah, being able to plan and budget effectively.
Exactly. And they also had all this great historical data that they could look back on and analyze, see what worked, what didn't work, and use that to inform their future decisions.
Yeah, I bet that was really valuable for them, just being able to really dig into the numbers and really understand the drivers behind their performance.
Absolutely. And I think another big benefit was the reporting aspect. They were able to create these really comprehensive reports for senior management and for their investors that really detailed every aspect of their profit and loss.
Yeah, that's so important, because it's not just about, having the data. It's about being able to communicate it effectively to the people who need to see it.
Exactly.
So really powerful results from this example.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to another company that we looked at. This one was a global software as a service company operating in the blockchain and crypto space. And, it's a totally different industry, but they were facing some very specific financial planning challenges as well.
Right. And their main challenge really revolved around managing headcount. For a rapidly growing company, keeping track of employees can be really difficult, especially when you're global and you have people all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that a lot of companies in the tech space struggle with, right? They're hiring so quickly, they're expanding so rapidly that just keeping track of who's on board and where they are and what they're working on, it can become a real headache.
Oh, yeah. And before they implemented Workday Adaptive Planning, it was all manual. They were using spreadsheets and emails to try to keep track of all this information, and it was just a mess.
Yeah, I can imagine. And, it's not just about, having the data right. It's about being able to make sense of it, to analyze it, and to use it to make informed decisions. So what they did was they worked with a partner to create a purpose-built personnel model within Workday Adaptive Planning. And this was a really game changer for them because what it did was it integrated directly with your HR system.
Right. So now all of their HR data was automatically flowing into Workday Adaptive Planning, which meant that they no longer had to manually update spreadsheets or send emails back and forth.
Oh, wow. So they basically just completely eliminated all that manual work.
Yeah, pretty much. And it saved them so much time and effort. Think about all the hours that they used to spend just trying to keep their headcount data up to date.
Yeah, and I bet it reduced the risk of errors as well, right? Because anytime you're manually entering data, there's always the potential for human error. So what were some of the kind of key benefits that they saw from implementing this personnel model?
Well, for one, they finally had a single source of truth for all of their headcount data.
Yeah, that's huge.
Everyone in the company could access the same information, and they knew that it was accurate and up to date.
Yeah, no more conflicting spreadsheets floating around.
Exactly. And they were also able to really drill down into the data and get really granular insights. They could see things like headcount by department, by location, by job title, and that allowed them to make much more informed decisions about hiring and resource allocation.
Yeah, really powerful stuff. And I bet it also helped them with their workforce planning, right? Being able to look out into the future and say, okay, based on our current growth trajectory, we're going to need to hire X number of people in these roles in these locations.
Absolutely. It gave them a lot more control over their workforce planning. And, for a fast-growing company, that's super important.
Yeah, for sure. So really impressive results from that second example as well.
Yeah, I think it really highlights the power of automation and integration when it comes to financial planning.
For sure. Now let's move on to our third and final example for today. And this one is a fast-growing software as a service company that provides online data solutions for insurance companies.
Okay, interesting. So again, a very specific niche within the tech industry.
Yeah, exactly. And, like a lot of software as a service companies, they started out small. Their finance team was pretty lean, and they were relying heavily on Excel for their planning.
Yeah, that's pretty typical.
Yeah, but the director of finance at this company, he actually had some prior experience with Workday Adaptive Planning, and he was really eager to implement it at his new company because he knew the benefits that it could bring.
So he was already familiar with the platform and knew that it could handle the complexities of a software as a service business model.
Yeah, exactly. And he knew that even though they were still a relatively small company, they had big ambitions, and they wanted to have a really robust and sophisticated FP&A function.
Yeah, that's smart. A lot of companies wait until they're much larger before they really invest in FP&A, but it's actually much better to start early.
Yeah, you want to build that foundation early on so that you can scale as you grow.
Exactly.
And, as a software as a service company, their financial models really needed to reflect that annual recurring revenue. That's, the lifeblood of their business.
Right.
So they worked with a partner called Revelwood to build a revenue model within Workday Adaptive Planning that specifically incorporated their annual recurring revenue streams.
And I'm guessing this allowed them to really drill down into their profit and loss and see all the different factors that were impacting their bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. And the director of finance, he actually mentioned that, their company is a very low asset company. They don't have a lot of capital expenditure, so their profit and loss is really their main focus.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they're using Workday Adaptive Planning for their multi-year planning as well. They're looking out 2 to 3 years into the future, which is really important in the fast-paced software as a service industry.
Absolutely. You have to be able to anticipate what's coming down the road and make sure that you're positioned for success.
So what were some of the kind of key benefits that this company experienced after implementing Workday Adaptive Planning?
Well, for one, they were finally able to do multi-year planning, which was something that they hadn't been able to do before, with Excel. It was just too difficult to manage.
Yeah. Spreadsheets are great for certain things, but when you're trying to do complex multi-year planning, they can really become a bottleneck.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So Workday Adaptive Planning really opened up those possibilities for them.
Yeah, and they were also able to get much more detailed reporting on their profit and loss data. They could really slice and dice the numbers and see things from all different angles.
Yeah, that granular level of detail can be so valuable for decision making.
Absolutely. And another big benefit was that they were able to integrate Workday Adaptive Planning with their existing general ledger and ERP system.
Yeah, that's so important, right? Because you don't want to have to manually transfer data between systems. It's just asking for errors.
Exactly. So having that seamless integration really streamlined their processes and made their lives a lot easier.
So really great results from that third example as well.
Yeah, I think it's another great example of how Workday Adaptive Planning can be tailored to meet the specific needs of a software as a service company.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things that's really stood out to me as we've been going through these examples is just how flexible Workday Adaptive Planning is.
Right? It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You can really customize it to fit your specific business model and your specific needs.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's so popular in the software as a service and tech space, because, these companies are constantly evolving and changing, and their financial planning tools need to be able to keep up.
Absolutely.
So let's kind of zoom out a little bit and think about the big picture here. We've looked at three very different examples of software as a service companies that have all benefited from Workday Adaptive Planning. But what are some of the common threads that we're seeing across all of these examples?
Well, I think the biggest one is just the ability to get better insights into their financials. All of these companies were able to really drill down into the numbers and see things that they couldn't see before.
Yeah, that granular level of detail is so important for making informed decisions.
Exactly. And I think another common thread is the efficiency gains that they all saw. By automating tasks and integrating systems, they were able to free up a lot of time and resources.
Yeah, and that time and those resources can then be redirected to more strategic initiatives.
Absolutely. And I think the third common thread is just the ability to do more sophisticated planning.
Yeah.
All of these companies were able to implement multi-year planning and really start thinking about the long term, which is something that's essential for any successful business.
Yeah, that's so true. Especially in the fast-paced world of software as a service, you have to be able to anticipate what's coming down the road and plan accordingly.
Exactly.
So I think, what we've seen today is that Workday Adaptive Planning is a really powerful tool for software as a service and tech companies, and it can really help them to achieve their financial goals.
Absolutely.
So if you're part of a software as a service or tech company and you're looking for a better way to manage your financials, I would definitely encourage you to check out Workday Adaptive Planning.
Yeah, I think it's worth taking a look at.
And if you want to learn more about Workday Adaptive Planning and how it can benefit your company, you can visit www.revelwood.com.
They have a lot of great resources on their website.
So that's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.